Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Actor Training in the 21st Century, a Global Perspective. I am delighted to be joined this afternoon by two colleagues from Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. I'm being joined by Melissa Vera Maramara, otherwise known as Missy. Professor Maramara is an assistant professor in the newly founded theater department. She teaches theater, acting and performance, the history of drama, and she's also an actress who was trained in the U.S. at the University of Arkansas, where she earned her MFA. She joins us with Professor Ricardo Abad, Ricky, if I may. Professor Abad earned his PhD from Fordham University in sociology and has an esteemed career as one looking at socio-cultural matters relative to theater practice. He's also a celebrated director, particularly of Shakespeare's work. He's currently chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Ateneo University. And he happens to also be the current president of the Asia Pacific Bureau of Theater Schools, a esteemed consortium of some of the leading theater training programs throughout Southeast Asia. I'm so grateful to have you both here today with me. Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Peter. Very excited.
My pleasure. Missy, let's start with you. You're teaching into the theater program, you teach acting, and I'd love if you can offer a snapshot as to what are some of the approaches and how perhaps you negotiate Western practices, which are indeed very much a part of the program as I've come to understand it, with a Filipino student population.
So theater in the Philippines has a very long tradition, even before the colonization of the Spanish, more than 300 years ago. But it was westernized and used as a pedagogical tool, theater, when the Americans came in the turn of the 1900s. And so when the educational system was being developed as we know it at present, it was a very American style of education. And theater was used to train students in articulation and clarity of thought and expression. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, when the Filipinization movement started and a lot of Filipino texts were coming out, Shakespeare classics were being translated by Rolando Tino, who eventually became Ricky's teacher in the university, or a colleague in the University of Ateneo when he came back from Fordham. And Tino, who became National Artist for Theater, started this huge movement that Ricky continued in the Ateneo. In 1998, Ricky finally formalized a theater arts program, which was housed in the Fine Arts Department. And I was one of the first students of this program. And I really loved how Ricky would direct Shakespeare, for example, by merging both the Filipino and the American or the East and West perspectives. Like, for example, in Pagpapaamo sa Maldita or Taming of the Shrew, Petruchio is an American soldier and he is trying to tame the Filipino. And the Maldita or the Shrew, Katharina, is a Filipino. And she speaks in Filipino Shakespeare, the translation by Tino. And eventually, as she is tamed, she slowly speaks English. But it's not American English, it's pidgin English. So you already see the tension of the colonization and the post-colonization that's happening, the appropriation of the text through this dramatic text and performance. In so speaking, and that's just an example of how acting is being done right now in the Ateneo, where we do have very Western styles such as Stanislavski or Meisner viewpoints, because the West has a wonderful way of articulating technique. Not to say that Filipinos or Asians do not have technique, it's just that we wear our hearts on our sleeves and we go into expression right away, and we really like, festivals and rituals. So a mixing of these things necessitates a negotiation of cultures where there is the step-by-step breaking down very rational ways of finding how to do things, right? And the very emotional, very explosive, very rooted in the now, in the context of the Filipino way of expressing. So that's where we are. But Ricky had mentioned, and he'll expound on this a little bit more later. We're getting very much influenced by our neighbors with the whole expressing culture through devised theater, which a lot of Western techniques are also applying, like in Tectonic Theater Project in New York. So there's that.
Well, thank you. And Ricky, to Missy's point, in the capacity of your expertise as a scholar of sociology, of theater, particularly working on plays of Shakespeare, and also in the capacity of your responsibility as president of the Asia Pacific Bureau, you've had a chance to travel throughout the region to meet colleagues, to explore what's happening at drama schools and theater academies throughout Southeast Asia. I was wondering if maybe you can speak to your experience a bit.
Yes, but sure, it's here. Let me just add to something that what Missy has already said. Um, in my early work with Shakespeare and trying to do post-colonial kind of work on that, the emphasis I wasn't using any particular technique, and they were all in my head. But I was very much interested because it was Shakespeare. I was very much interested in several things. One, the ability to speak on stage well, which Shakespeare allows you to do with the breath and the pause and the stresses. Plus the idea of thought, of thinking. This is some of the things I imbibed from my association with Rolando Pino, is that actors must be intelligent, all right? And actors must not just be, and it's the intelligence which shapes the feeling, and it's the intelligence which arrests any over emotionality in performance. So there must be critical thinking and there must be intelligence and all that work. Now, then from that you blend. So that's a very important thing. So I was rarely doing contemporary stuff. I was rarely doing Equius or Glass Menagerie or Tennessee Williams or any of the local plays. No, it was mostly classics. Later on, when I started doing the contemporary plays, and I began even with Japanese contemporary plays and American. Then it was begun. Then that's when I began to see where you can apply a lot of these other specialized techniques and the Meissners and the viewpoints and the stuff like that. Although a little bit of that gets into this experience. Now, when I go abroad to watch the acting in the different schools, I find a great deal of variation. Uh, I find that you have the whole tradition of classical, epic, traditional acting. I see it in the Indians because when they come to the festivals, they bring their own classical Indian plays, and the acting is really grand. It is rhetorical and oratorical and poetic and things like this. So you have that extreme from the Indians and occasionally from the Malaysians, all right, who would do things. But then you will also have the very contemporary ones from the Australians and the New Zealand people, and even with the Singapore people, all right. And you find a very great mix of those things. And it's when I began there to appreciate actually all forms, that there is no one form. There's just the play and there is what is the best thing for the play. So I just removed all of those biases in terms of what works and what does not work. And I find that most of the Asians, even let's say Koreans, and they with the in K arts, many of them are very very intense. But then they are also intense, but it's not the same kind of intensity as let us say the Australians or the New Zealand. It's how do I say it? They're still Asians. And the funny thing about you can study Stanislavski and you can study Meissner, and what comes out is not a Western actor. It's still Asian. It's an Asian which is maybe a little bit more how the intentional, more conscious, more aware, maybe different choices because of the different experiences. But what comes out is Asian. You know, I will not see a Meryl Streep in Asia. All right, but I would say somebody just as good, maybe in a different qualitative way. All right, because apparently cultures are not drowned by Stanislavski. Cultures, I think, Stanislavski, I think, shapes the culture, the actor in culture, to be more aware of the culture and to respond in terms of culture. perhaps in less emotional ways, perhaps in more thoughtful ways. If you're doing break, perhaps in using more gestures, whatever it is. But the Asian will show. And so when I watch the Korean or the Chinese or the Japanese, then I realize, you can teach all the systems they want. They will still come out Asians. Maybe a little bit more refined, maybe, or they will have a one form. This is Western acting. They'll do this. I remember in Shanghai, then the students were telling me, sir, can you give us a workshop on contemporary acting? Because here we just learn Chinese opera. We just learn codified things and we don't get much of the contemporary acting. All right. So years after I go there and I see some of them, they already have contemporary acting class, and it's not the same as I see in America or in Italy or in Spain. It's very different, and even internationally, the Spanish, the the Bulgarians, the Hungarians. It's really cultures appear. All right, that's why the interesting form is how do you blend all of this in one form. But
To add to
yes, Missy.
to add to Ricky's point, I'm still in touch with my classmates from UARC, and we read a lot of plays, right? And online with the whole pandemic happening. So the same American plays that we read, I read it with my colleagues, my fellow actors here in the Philippines, professional actors, and there's just something starkly different. It's still an American text. It's still very American English, but there's something else that comes out. And I think this is what Ricky's referring to, like the Asianness or the Filipino-ness comes out because of the experience of how people live together, how we perceive reality, how we negotiate conflict, and how we build community is somehow different. So even if either the acting technique or the dramatic text might be Western, there's something about a performance that will allow the culture to emerge.
Interesting. So it sounds to me your astute perceptions are that it really is an embodied practice, and through the very embodiment of an Asian actor, shall we say, in the context of perhaps an Asian audience, just begins to identify it as definitively Asian, in spite of the fact there might be Western techniques that are behind the process.
So the Western technique becomes a platform to scaffold the Asian truth to come out. It allows it to come out, allows it to be expressed and explored even deeply, more deeply.
Yeah.
The Indians have an interesting experiment. They tried doing one of their epic plays, and they said, okay, let's do this in a kind of Stanislavski style. All right. And so they changed the way the languages. But when you look at it, it's still Indian. It still looks like an epic, And I don't know how the experiment worked or not, but it's still, it's still very Indian. So I think, and I think the task I see now is just how do you make that Asian consciousness richer, actually? How do you get to use more of the experiences and the consciousness of being Asian or Filipino or Singapore or Chinese seep through the performance? All right. For instance, I'll give an example. Singapore. All right. This is your school. Singapore did in one show in Shanghai a cabaret performance. Now, a cabaret is a very Western kind of style. All right. It's a bit raunchy. It's a bit daring. It's yeah. But when the Singaporeans do it, they try to be like this, but there is still a bit of the Asianness in it. It never really explodes into a kind of light kind of thing. So I'm saying that you can feel all this Western practice, it will still come out Asian. And
I'll add to Ricky's example by what he directed. He directed a Japanese play with Filipino actors.
Another thing.
And so the play is very quiet. And Ricky's direction is very quiet. But there's still that Filipino noise that permeates, and that just kind of it wasn't a Japanese stillness. So while there was that quiet, the Japanese quiet and kind of, I lack for a better term, stillness, there was that Filipino chaos that was just underneath the surface that you could feel and you could hear without hearing and feel without feeling. if you want to go to Bottom's speech about what the eyes could hear, and
It's wonderful. Let me ask, how about the other way around? Have you seen, or certainly we can envision, um, Asian practices, Asian forms, from katakali to the work, obviously, of someone like Tadashi Suzuki, how that becomes manifest perhaps in a Western context. Now, in terms of Suzuki, obviously, a lot of Western schools use him or use his techniques for
I am
training.
I am I am rarely impressed. I'm rarely impressed if I see a Westerner do Suzuki or do something. I'm sorry, but it's just something there. It's just the shape of the body or something like that. Or that doesn't somehow register with me. Very rare. So I remember when, for instance, when Viewpoint is based, they say on Suzuki's footwork, whatever. But it's really unique. The Viewpoint is really unique. It may be Suzuki inspired, but it's still really shaped very American. And when you see it, it's Suzuki is credited, but it's really still very an American practice, kind of a thing. And even so, I think I don't know. What maybe Missy has a different view.
I
But there
think
are
it's
good
because
experts in Asian, but it doesn't seem to be. What is
I
it?
think it's because as Asians, we have so much feelings that we're not allowed to express outwardly, right? So it might be because of colonization or whatnot, like centuries of that we're used to just kind of, you know, turning everything in, but the feelings, emotions are so strong that they just explode, right? So if you see our performances, or our hearts are on our sleeves, we're always, not a matter, but like, to the effect that we're very emotional, right? While if you look at Western styles, it's, for example, the French, they're very talky. They like words, they like hearing themselves. Americans, they like the discourse, they like the ironies of language, and that's what they enjoy, right? Not so much the emotional outbursts. They like pulling that in. So there's that pulling in of the Western and the explosion of the Asian, if you're going to be essentialist about it, or simplistic about it. But and I guess why the techniques were developed in the West were to allow that access to the emotions. And I remember telling my professor, I called her at 2 a.m. because she had opened boxes, right? And I have like tremendous crazy access when it comes to feelings. So she had given us Meisner and she had given us Stanislavski, and I was like, and I couldn't stop it. It was just on and on. And so I called her at 2 a.m. and I said, Amy, I can't stop. And she said, oh my, Missy, I'm trained to help you open boxes, not close them. So um, the nice thing about that school, it had psychological services, so they were able to help kind of like scaffold that. So I think that's why Ricky might not have liked it in terms of aesthetics or personal preference, because what we're used to is explosive. And so if that kind of technique allows Westerners to be a little bit more, expressive, which is why I think Nushkin and the other French directors really had like an Orientalist kind of fascination with China and Japan and India, was because all of a sudden it wasn't just about words. It was about movement. It was about color. It was about a variety of crazy, non-rational, I put it in quotation marks, elements to the drama that opened them up suddenly. So and that's why I think it can get very like bitin. What's bitin in English, Ricky? Like you're almost there but not quite when you see a Westerner perform an Asian.
It's incomplete. It's not realized
Fully, because there's that, I guess, like a distancing.
Got it.
I mean, Brecht did a whole technique on alienation, right? So you kind of,
I don't think it'll ever be replicated. I think I just in the West they merge it with the Asian forms and it comes out
differently.
their own. We merged the Western thing and it comes out uniquely our own.
And even Asian mergings and intercultural theater, right? Usually we think of intercultural theater as West and Asian, but really even Asians borrow from each other and create new things that are, yeah.
And with new things in mind, final question, my friends, what future possibility do you see for cross-cultural experiences, both in the classroom studio as well as on stages, or even in the digital space for that matter. As the world shrinks in many ways, meaning that we can more globally interact with each other. What possibilities do you envision for your program, perhaps, or just
I
at
have
large?
many ideas there, and I think if I can remember, one is that I think theater now should strive more for like global kinds of cooperation and solidarity. Our salvation in the next 100 years will depend on how we can act globally, and I think we can use the openness now in theater. And for my where I am now with APB and the international circle, use that to find more opportunities really for students to act globally and work globally and let those traditions fuse together in some form. Then there must be certain messages, what stories, what meanings can theater give to the world now? You know, it's not the communist story, it's not the populist story, it's not the nationalist story, it's not the liberalist story, it's not the Bible story. What story will make a difference now in the future? And I think part of that is trying to establish in actors, how can I, as an actor, be more aware of my connection to mend a larger force, not just my nation or my group. And this is why I'm getting into meditation and psychophysical. And when I was in Dubai for a conference, I met someone from Greece, an anthropologist. So it's an ally, kind of a sister discipline. And he was doing field work in the theater, and he was saying, Ricky, I look at performance in the community, and the thing I notice in community performances when they sing songs and do theater in villages is their soul. How can we get our performers or professional performers to have soul? So now he and I are talking about spirituality and performance. Many performances are ego. What am I? I think maybe what he's trying to tell me is that maybe there's a way in which you can think of performance as spiritual, as collective, as consciousness with the word. I don't know how this will shape, but I think that's the more idea I'm thinking for the future. We cannot rely on the old ways. I mean, the ways of, I mean, not all the time. I think that times have changed and our consciousness should expand. And I think we should expand even the training process. And I'm not sure how to do it. I think my hypothesis is that meditation might help, but I'm not sure where that's going to lead me in the future.
Wonderful.
But Missy, maybe you, and I talked to Missy about this before I even launched it. And Missy and I have been he's my sounding board.
Ricky's always been such a wonderful mentor, and I really learned so much from him. Um, he was the one who started really the intercultural tradition that I am familiar with, and I seek to keep exploring. And even now, having been exposed to American training and French training, there's really, in the context of the pandemic and how we are all trapped in our homes, it's how we can use theater to go within and connect without. It's how we can self regulate and be connected to our bodies in front of this medium of the camera. Right now, that theater is not allowed in many places where we are removed from each other physically. We cannot share that space, and that visceral, tangible energy is deprived of us in performance. What can we therefore do to still stay or deepen our humanity, still stay human and even deepen that humanity further? So I think we look to both East and West and all these techniques that are being offered and shared and exchanged, talked about and read about really in the online platform, which I think is one good thing that came out of this whole pandemic.
Indeed.
Yeah, and besides, I think we all agreed when we had a faculty meeting that if we do online, let us strive to respect the integrity of the online form and see what really we can do, and not just make it, oh, this is just low grade, second grade theater we're teaching. We cannot afford to do that. We have to say, well, this is online, this is our form now. What can we do to make it meaningful and make it work for us? and in,
To
in,
enhance
in,
life.
in my other classes, in meditation, you're supposed to think and you're supposed to, on your own, blast rays of love to your neighbors and to your city and to everything else. Now, that's a very online thing. How can you sit there looking at there and then thinking about the world and blasting love? That's your connection to the it's energy. It's not the physical thing, the contact. It's not saliva. It's not muscle and sweat. It's energy that you spread online. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe that's how we can make the online thing work and still make it relevant to people. And so you don't think of it as second rate or second less theater. A different form of theater, but not necessarily.
A different form of theater indeed that perhaps will guide us to the future as we come back to perhaps the more traditional form at some point in time when this pandemic subsides. So who knows? It might be a blessing in disguise. The
We'll
Chinese,
choose to see it as a blessing.
yeah, the Chinese talk about crisis having the word crisis has two meanings to it. It's you
Yes,
nodding, Missy, right?
yes,
It connotes danger, but also possibility. And it's the latter, I think, on which we perhaps may want to lean as we move forward. And in moving forward, I want to thank you both for your time this afternoon. I've had the pleasure, indeed the honor, of speaking with Professor Ricardo Abad and Assistant Professor Missy Maramara, both of Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for your work. Thank you
also
for your
good.
time.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Pete.
much, Peter.
Cheers.